think of in preparing this slide. And one in particular is this device pictured here uses red and green colors to indicate the state of the device. And of course, that's not going to work very well for colorblind people. About 1 in 12 men are colorblind, and about 1 in 200 women are colorblind. Turns out this device actually uses a flashing signal as well to get people's attention. But I just thought, boy, that wasn't really well thought out as far as that design of that device. And that, in my opinion, represents an inclusivity bug. It wasn't thinking of a particular group of people. Another example, I have a colleague that's since left Livermore Labs, but mentioned to me Taco Tuesdays. And it turns out a part of the program that he was working in at the time, a lot of the discussions over things like promotions or new responsibilities or different projects that were going on with the organization were those conversations were had at offsite sort of informal meetings, Taco Tuesdays, to which he was never invited in the 2 or 3 years he was involved in that project. And then, of course, last one is inclusive language. So I want to talk about inclusivity in general here, and there's a lot of dimensions to inclusion. Many of them, some of them you're probably familiar with: race, ethnicity, gender identity, religion, age, disability. But there's actually just a ton of other dimensions that I don't think we often think about, but are sort of included in our concepts of inclusion. Things like neurodiversity, handedness. 10% of the world is lefties, but the world is really designed for right-handed people. Dyslexia. I have dyslexia, especially when I'm tired. Various impairments, and I'm just listing a handful that I could think of when I put this slide together. There's many more. I'll focus on disability just for a moment here, because we all in our lives are likely to experience disability, hopefully just temporarily. But an example is my wife hurt her leg in a fall, and we had to move around in a wheelchair for a while, and we got real aware of finding access, wheelchair ramps into buildings was a real problem. So, when we're being inclusive for persons with disability, we're actually being inclusive of our future selves in all likelihood. So inclusivity has an impact on productivity. I won't go into all of these here. I'll just mention a few. It helps, leads to more creative and innovative solutions in projects, and it leads to increased uptake, adoption, better user satisfaction, and more successful products. But there's many other reasons that inclusivity impacts productivity. Just a lesson on inclusive language from the moon landings. Turns out I'm a space nut, so I always like to talk about space program whenever I can. But this is some of the language that was used either when Armstrong first set foot on the moon or in a conversation he had with President Nixon by telephone from the White House later. And you see men and man mentioned all over the place. Women were not mentioned once. This was an event that was seen by probably 1 of 5 people on the planet at the time. Something that I thought of later on, actually a little bit more recently, is how powerful it might have been is just before Armstrong and Aldrin went back into the lunar module, they had planted a flag that looked like this as well to say, we came here for everybody. Of course, they did say that in their actual words, but having done that, I think that would have made a profoundly inclusive statement for the entire world. Okay, so what inclusive language is not? It's not about banning words, and it's not about things like being woke or politically correct or language policing. It's definitely not about trying to avoid offending any particular person. It's not about censorship or stifling freedom of expression, but I can understand why people might have that feeling, and we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. So what inclusive language is, this is my take. It's about recognizing many commonly used terms and phrases inadvertently perpetuate a widely shared injustice. And I'll just kind of break that down a little bit. Inadvertently means often used without deep knowledge or appreciation for the origin or impact of a word or phrase. That it perpetuates that it perpetuates, normalizes, amplifies, continues, or makes worse. Widely shared. Many people, often members of a protected class, are affected. And that it represents an injustice of some kind, bias, stereotype, all the way through prejudice, discrimination, oppression, genocide. So it's about recognizing many commonly used terms and phrases inadvertently perpetuate a widely shared injustice and being willing to adjust language to stop or minimize such perpetuation. So before I get into inclusive language specifically, I'm going to talk about some commonly accepted language adjustments we all already do, actually. So common one is when experts are speaking to novices. When we're in that situation, we try to avoid a lot of the jargon that we typically use. So instead of using the word algorithm, we might use, step-by-step instructions. Instead of saying NP complete, we might say it's impossible to solve when the problem gets really large. Instead of GPU, we might say a number cruncher, things like that. And I'm just curious, maybe you can type in the chat, although I'm not paying attention to chat. Let me see if I can get that up real quick so I can at least see it on the side here. Give me a moment. There we go. And I'm going to shrink my window just a bit here. Wonder if anybody's ever encountered this word before, and if you have, maybe type in the chat. And if somebody wants to take a whack at trying to pronounce it, come off mute and try to pronounce it. Duncan, yes.
Oh, my.
Fear of large words. Yes, that's, I'll pronounce it. It's hippopotamonstrosesquipedaliophobia. And it's actually kind of a tongue-in-cheek word that was constructed within the last 20 years. And it's intended to mean the fear of long words, fear of large words. So definitely a term you typically wouldn't use too often. Just genericized words. So I'll read this. The Xerox machine in the RJet room also serves as a PostScript printer. To print your Google results, select the machine from the list and hit the print button. After collecting your pages, be sure to wipe out the tray with a Kleenex, available in the pouch, Velcro to the side of the machine. The process is just a Band-Aid until new printers become available. Can anybody think of anything wrong with that paragraph? And if you can think of it, maybe type in the chat what you think may be wrong with it. Okay, it doesn't look like I have any takers on that. So all of these are actually registered trademarks. And you cannot use those words, especially in public places, without facing potential trademark enforcement action. Just real quick, I'm curious if anybody here knows what RJet means. I see Eric. Yeah.
Remote job entry terminal.
Thank you. Yes. So that's very, very Livermore specific speak. And it's probably specific to the 1970s and 80s here, but you still see a lot of rooms that have RJet printed on the outside of them where we keep our printers, especially in like building 111. So another kind of thing you often see happen is idioms and euphemisms. So we see things like, instead of saying the actual word, the C word, the F word, the L word, we use these all the time, an F-bomb or an a-hole, see that, WTF or snafu. Having a senior moment, we say often use the phrase passed away instead of died and so forth. So there's a lot of these examples, and I'm sure many of you could think of others. Good manners. So pictured on the right there is Linus Torvalds at a meeting in which he famously flipped off somebody from NVIDIA. But you can imagine somebody that's entered this response to a pull request on GitHub, for example. Your code is a bleeping disaster. You should really learn to write clean code. This is basic stuff, and it's surprising to see someone struggling with such simple concepts. Fix this pile of whatever ASAP. We obviously, none of us think that would be a good way to do business. And so we might have something more to the point on the bottom there. And one observation from this is that often inclusive language can involve a little bit more effort. So another reason we might replace words is proximity to bad things. An example is the Chevy Nova. When it was, this is an urban legend that the Nova means can't go. In Nova in Spanish, we can't go. But that's actually urban legend. You'll see a lot of stuff online about how Chevy needed to change the name of Nova in order to sell their car in Latin America. That is not true. However, it is true that Ford Pinto had trouble selling in Brazil. They had to change the name to Corcel. Microsoft's Bing had a major problem in China, and they had to change it to BIYING. Both those cases had to do with, well, let's see, you can find it online. I won't get into why they needed to change their names, but those names in those cultures had a proximity to things that just were not too respected. If you like the Jenny song, 8675309, for example, when that song came out, there were hundreds of people in this country that had to change their telephone numbers. And the reason for that is people were trying to dial that number and apparently reach out to Jenny. My wife has a business, the Culture Co-op. We have a hyphen in the domain name co-op, and that's been all sorts of problems. It would have been much better to have an underscore. So anyhow, obviously for us, we deal with a lot of nuance in what we do. So another way in which we're concerned about language is somebody's filing an issue. Well, is it a bug or is it a feature request? And you might see a team argue at length over whether or not this person has requested. That's not really a bug. This is the way the software is designed to work. So what they're asking for is for us to enhance or change our software. Another one I'm really familiar with in this regard is the concept of portable performance that had to really get refined in the last 10 years, especially with the onslaught of GPUs being used in a lot of our big systems. So I'm sure you can think of others. I listed a few others there. The point of all this is to say that we're already accustomed to adjusting language in many contexts and for various reasons, and software development and its associated artifacts is just another context, and inclusion is just another reason. So I'll pause there for a minute. I guess, well, let me go on to one more concept, one or two more slides, and I'll pause for see if there are any questions. So I want to talk briefly about the concept of holding two truths. So we've all seen this example before, is the cup half empty or half full? And one of the challenges I have when we speak to a group working at a science lab, for example, is someone's always bound to say, you know, Mark, that cup is completely full. It's just partially filled with liquid and the other part of it's filled with gas, which is definitely true also. But I think we're all accustomed to holding two truths. Here are some sciencey kind of examples: wave particle duality of light, general relativity and quantum mechanics, two different sort of ways of modeling the physical world. Bubble sort is the worst, or bubble sort is the best. I think it depends on whether we're talking about space performance or memory performance. I think I'm a good person. I can perpetuate systemic biases if I'm not careful. The reason I mention this is that for some, inclusive language might feel like it is not nearly enough to meet the moment. For others, it'll feel like it's way too much. And I think we can acknowledge both perspectives. Software development is somewhat unique regarding the power to name things. As software developers, we name a lot of things, and developing a practice of and sensitivity for language choices is perhaps more important in software activity than many other endeavors. The challenge is we're attached to the names of a lot of things. I'm listing several there: Pythagoras theorem, Halley's comet, Kramer's rule, Euler's formula. All of those are examples of things that are named and attributed to specific peoples or cultures, when the truth is those things were invented by other cultures that never get attributed to them. So I just wanted to mention those for people's awareness. All right, I'll pause there and I'll just see if there are any questions. I see Valgrind has entered the chat. Patrick, I wasn't sure. I'm not sure about your chat there. Maybe that was a humorous message to something else that we were discussing. But if anybody has questions or comments and what they've seen so far, you're welcome to unmute and ask or type in the chat. Okay. All right. So I just want to give you a warning. The remaining slides includes language and images which may elicit strong emotions, but talking objectively and authoritatively about the use of inclusive language and technology includes a discussion about specific terminology, its history, prevalence, and egregiousness. So the purpose is to inform, inspire deeper thought, and engage in meaningful dialogue. So I'm going to go into some examples here: master, slave, sanity check, and abort. These are examples you see actually right in code. And then brown bag, rule of thumb, and Merry Christmas. These are examples from writing and general communication. I'll do a deep dive on master, slave, and then I'll just do individual slides on some of the others. So this concept of master slave relies upon a literary device of analogy or metaphor to quickly convey some deeper meaning in a piece of software technology. Often when one object's behavior is designed or controlled to follow another. So what is the analogy being based on? Ultimately, it's being based on the relationship between a master and a slave in the practice of enslavement. So it turns out this is pervasive. I mean, it's all over technology. And you can see it in remote manipulator arms, flip-flops, jumpers on IDER drives, cylinders used in automobile braking systems. I mean, it's literally all over the place. It originated, this is a Google Ngram viewer of the frequency of usage of this terminology. The belief is that it probably originated around the time of this article from a researcher at Argonne, as it turns out, developing a remote manipulator arm. You can stand outside of a box, and it's almost like a glove box, except the arms inside the box are robotic. And that's where the terminology may have first been used in technology, and it's just proliferated from there. If you go onto GitHub, you'll literally find millions of hits on it. And if you look really hard, you can find some just really egregious examples of the juxtaposition of master and slave and other types of processes and the names for those processes that are used in software. By the way, there are tons of links in these slides, and I will give these slides to Eric when I'm done so that he can make them available to people. But the links are designed to back up a lot of what I'm saying and provide additional context. Just in scientific software alone, this master-slave terminology is used in many places. I'm listing several there. Slide surfaces in particular. So the reason I'm familiar with this is a long time ago, I actually did a little work on the AL3D source code, and this terminology was in the code at the time. It's since been removed, and I'll talk about that later. But at the time, there was this concept of contact surfaces, where one surface is considered sort of the leading the surface, and then all the other surfaces that come into contact with that surface sort of have to obey what that surface is saying in the way, basically in what the actual position, the geometric position of those objects are. And so master-slave terminology was being used in that context. The problem is that continued even after the algorithm changed so much that there was no one object that was treated specially anymore. All the objects were sort of peers to each other. That's the way the new algorithm works in AL3D. But the language didn't change until more recently. So it actually conveyed the wrong impression about how the software actually worked. Turns out that's actually true of a lot of cases of the use of this terminology in software, is it really is an inaccurate representation of what the software is doing. So where does the terminology manifest? It's literally everywhere. You know, data type names, variable names, function names, whatever, you name it, it appears everywhere, including people's mental models, which is probably the biggest concern. Calls to change this terminology date back probably to the mid-90s. There's a few articles written about it. The Los Angeles Unified School District is the first online instance I can find where an organization was saying we don't want to see this anymore. It happened to do in a procurement for IDE hard drives. They were procuring a bunch of hard drives for their computers. What about the term master in isolation? There's far less consensus on this, notably even in the Black community. You'll note probably, I think around 2019 or 2018, the default branch name for Git, it used to be master, and it was changed to main when Microsoft basically took over GitHub or Git. I can't remember the details of that. Replacement terms for master-slave terminology: manager, worker, leader, follower, controller, doer, primary, secondary. That probably is not going to work too well at a place like Livermore. We'll talk a little bit about that. Primary, replicant. So that's it on a sort of a cursory overview of master-slave. I'll go into individual slides of some of these others real quick. Sanity check. So the usage of this is, you know, this doesn't pass a basic sanity check, someone might say, or can you sanity check this? Look over my shoulder. The earliest use that I can find in technology, I spent quite a bit of time, is probably around 1980 in an AT&T manual having to do with mobile phones, as it turns out, mobile phone systems. May perpetuate stereotypes and stigmas around mental health. Many bloggers, universities, organizations have spoken to it, including the National Institutes of Health. Proposed alternative: spot check, smoke check, integrity check. Abort. This is baked right into the Unix operating system, C standard library, and because of that, it's used in other places like MPI or pthread libraries. It literally originates from the 1570s Latin terminology, where it is relating to the end of a pregnancy, and it was applied to situations other than pregnancy starting in the early 1900s. May perpetuate religious or gender bias. It's highly traumatization potential. On the other hand, there are not a lot of calls that I can find online to replace this terminology, except at the Inclusive Naming Initiative. And even the Inclusive Naming Initiative is somewhat wishy-washy on to the extent to which they think this this should be replaced. And I think this has to do with how embedded this terminology is in technology. But some proposed alternatives: cancel, halt, fail, fault, scrub. Brown bag. This is an interesting one. Typical usage: hey, we're having a brown bag session today. Why don't you come? Or I'm brown bagging it. The origin for this, there's multiple known origins. The use of a brown paper bag to bring one's own food or alcohol to an event. Another case that's well known, it was reported and studied actually significantly by Audrey Elisa Kerr. The concept of a brown bag event derives from an event where a person could attend only if their skin was lighter than a brown paper bag. So there is belief that this may perpetuate racial bias, discrimination, colorism. There's been a lot of public discourse on this. I was recently called in for using the term within the last 6 months and asked not to use it. It is an idiom, so it's not necessarily understood by non-English speakers, and some proposed alternatives are casual, bring your own, informal. Rule of thumb. So the way this might be used as a general rule of thumb, PR should be sized to review in less than 15 minutes. The origin for this is highly debated. There's a lot of false information out on that. And one false etymology relates to beating of one's wife with a cane that was based on an article written in the 1990s, right around the time the World Wide Web started to take off. Most scholars have discredited this false etymology, but the perception persists. I've also been called in on using rule of thumb. It is an idiom as well. It's understood. So again, it's not going to be understood by non-English speakers. Proposed alternatives: typical rule, standard practice, rough estimate. Okay, finally, Merry Christmas. So obviously it's a greeting or parting phrase around December 25th. Origin, really hard to tell, probably, England in the mid 1500s. Although if you go to the UK today, you won't hear Merry Christmas. You'll hear Happy Christmas in all likelihood. May perpetuate religious bias. It really depends on context. So there's a lot of key Christian observances that are the only ones that are recognized as U.S. federal holidays. There are many other religious holidays that are, of course, not recognized as U.S. federal holidays. And so that is the context in which the use of the term Merry Christmas may have experienced that kind of bias. And obviously the alternatives, we've all heard them, happy holidays, season greetings, winter wishes. All right, I'll pause there. Let's see. I'll just pause if there are any questions or comments anybody would like to make, either in the chat or come off mute. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go a little bit deeper on the activity to replace master slave in a few contexts. I'm aware of the work that went on in AL3D and Sierra because I interviewed the people who did this. So AL3D, of course, is Livermore code. It's one of our flagship simulation codes. And Sierra is a flagship simulation code at Sandia. So in the late 2020, multiple teams at various labs began considering replacement language. It actually started with Benjamin Spencer on the Moose team at Idaho National Lab. And then Ben Liu on the L3D team and Gabriel Jose de Frias on the Sierra team got involved. The problem with this is there are many dependencies, and this is just a picture of all the different dependencies in AL3D, for example, where this terminology, master-slave terminology, is used. And so if it's going to be replaced, how do we make sure we cover all of those? So I'm just reading the chat, apologize. Okay, thanks for that. I'll follow up with that chat in a moment. So one of the first things that came from INEL is, well, let's just replace master slave with primary secondary. And that just really was not going to fly here at Livermore because of how easily those topics could be confused with things required classified handling. So ultimately, after a lot of work of a lot of the people involved, they all decided, all the code teams decided side A and side B were sufficient for what they really needed to be, especially when they're talking about contact surface algorithms or slide surface algorithms. So in the AL3D code, the goal was to replace all instances of master slave and any variables that derived from those concepts in the code. So for example, if you had this loop for s equals 0, s and n less than n SLVS. It's obvious that's derived from that terminology. Ben's goal was to remove all of that from the code. So there was nothing, either the explicit terminology or terminology derived from it. I guess close to 200 files were changed and 1,200 lines of code were changed in the L3D. No bugs were introduced. And then there were various changes to documentation, data files, and PowerPoint slides. The Sierra experience largely mimicked that. I think I'll skip over the slide on Sierra, but it was largely similar. So some other observations: there was no funding, no new funding to do the work on replacing master slave. Other deliverables were delayed to complete that work, and I think that's relevant. It suggests the commitment of the teams to try to do it. There was extensive dialogue involved in getting everybody on board with changing the terminology, why it was being changed, and agreeing to do it. And it turns out project management on these teams had actually wanted to change this terminology in the source code for quite some time, but they couldn't necessarily generate the interest to make it happen. And it was the summer of 2020 that helped to generate a groundswell of interest in doing something to push the needle. So it turns out I recently went through the similar activity in Visit to try to change the terminology. In fact, I haven't finished the pull request, but it was about 100 source files, maybe 1,000 lines of code that were actually changed. Very, very minor changes to public interface. There was one instance of a public interface that the terminology needed to change. There are some data files that we use. We have data from sources all over the place, and it's not easy to change some of the data files. Some of them we could change. For example, silo files we could easily change, but files from other sources, we're not able to change those. And so there are a handful of data files in our test suite that probably will continue to have this terminology in it. All right, I'll pause there if anybody has any questions, and maybe I can circle back. Okay, so Robert, thanks for that comment regarding autism, for example, and terminology used there. Thank you. Did you need to add a new definition, of the new terms? I know we didn't. In Visit, I did manager worker, so no, I thought that was pretty clear. I thought all the cases where master slave was replaced with manager worker maintained the same meaning of all of the code and comments. So hopefully that answered your question. Okay, I'm gonna move on. So there are other examples. Yeah, so it almost allows for more specificity for how the relationships of objects act. I agree. You know, I agree with that. There are a lot of cases where the terminology, master slave terminology, is used, and it really actually does not capture the nuance of how the objects interact. Other examples of this: blacklist, whitelist being replaced with deny list, allow list, grandfathered being replaced with legacy status. There's some people calling not to use kill and instead use stop, terminate, end. Different of these words may be useful. For example, stop doesn't work for me as a replacement for kill, because kill, at least when we're killing a process in Linux, we're not stopping that process. We're doing something different to bring it to an end. So we're doing more than stopping it. Cakewalk, things like low man on the totem pole, off the reservation, long time no see. I could go into those if you wanted me to, but I'm just mentioning them. So where does cakewalk come from? Let's see. Why don't we hold that, if you don't mind, Duncan, we'll hold that till the end. It actually has, it's steeped in racial practices in the United States in the 19 or 18, well, but before the Civil War, for example. All right, so let's see. I said I'd share some resources with you, inclusive language resources. So the first is the Inclusive Naming Initiative. It turns out I was involved in that effort for about 2 years. There's plenty of other inclusive language guidelines online. There's Microsoft's Inclusive Design and Bias-Free Communication, Google's Write Inclusive Documentation, there's Apple's Style Guide. One of the things that's really good is the Federal Plain Language Guide. That guide, plain language, just being plain about your language, is a really good way to communicate. So avoiding things like euphemisms and other things. And when you do that, you also avoid some of this inclusive language stuff as well. The National Institute of Standards in Technology Inclusive Language Guide, ACM Inclusive Language Resources. So these are basically online resources, and many of them will have a list of terms that they've decided action should be taken on in some way. And they're not all equal. Some are supersets of others, some are subsets of others. It kind of depends. As far as tooling goes, yes, Stephanie, I'm going to give the slides to Eric so that you can get links to all those things from them. So in word processing products, there's some built-in capability. For example, in Microsoft Word, depending on whether you're in Windows or Mac OS, there's ways of turning on things that will help inclusive language, even in Microsoft Outlook. Now, Google Docs tried to introduce a AI writing assistant in early April of 2022 for this, and in late April, it was withdrawn. I mean, it just did not go very well at all. So I think it was out on the market for a week or two. There is some command line tooling as well. Inclusiveness Analyzer by Microsoft, Words Really Matter by IBM. There is, in fact, a tool named Woke, which I really don't like that name, but it turns out it's pretty popular and used in a number of different places, including in GitHub Actions and VS Code extension. So that's some of the tooling that is available. I honestly think the community is pretty weak on actual tooling. All right, some closing thoughts. So the first thing I want to say, this is a potentially slippery slope. So where does it end? My first question is, why does it need to end? I actually don't think it does need to end, but it does need to be managed along with a lot of other priorities. So when should an inclusivity bug be fixed? I'm going to try to give you my sense of how you might go about deciding this. One is when it represents a pervasive, persistent, and egregious issue, and when it affects multiple stakeholders who have voiced their concerns over it. And I'm saying this, it's important to listen to people who are voicing their concerns, especially people from the affected groups. And also when there's shared consensus to prioritize, it emerges. And consensus can't be the opinions of a handful of gatekeepers, like one or two gatekeepers saying, no, we don't need to do that. That's not what I mean by consensus. Consensus does not mean what everybody else in the community is doing either, because you will find all sorts of efforts online where people are just listing off words after words. We can't use that word anymore. And I think that can be very distracting and not very helpful, at least in the context in which we need to operate. If you have been involved in any Oscar proposals, those proposals now have peer plans that are involved in them. And one of the things that you could consider including in a peer plan is addressing inclusive language issues in your project. So continuing some closing thoughts. So we already pay a lot of attention to language in many contexts. Turns out we already invest heavily in inclusion if you look at the code we write. So instead of take the people away, take the documentation away, just look at the software we write. We do all sorts of things to make sure that software is inclusive of other software. So we have data and interface interoperability. We have performance portability so that it can run on multiple different systems, application programming interface and application binary interface compatibility and version compatibility across those. We support interfaces with C, C++, Fortran, Python. That's language binding interoperability. We support multiple precision, single precision, double precision, half precision. I mean, we really, really do a lot in our software to be inclusive of other pieces of software. I just think that's an interesting observation. We already do continuous testing, integration, and deployment. So my question is, why can't we do continuous inclusion as well? Let's see, I've already talked about the rule of thumb a little bit and just how, I personally think it's fine to use that phrase. There's still a lot of hype out there on the internet on how that somehow relates to wife-beating practices in England in the 1500s, but it's been largely debunked. But another example of this, the quote, "Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results." That was not Albert Einstein, but you will find that that's attributed to Einstein all over the place online. And by the way, ChatGPT will very authoritatively repeat all of this stuff to you when you go ask ChatGPT about something. Horses still measured by hand. Oh, interesting, Laura. It sounds like there's interesting dialogue. I haven't been paying attention in the chat, but hopefully we can get to that. Some other closing thoughts. So poorly managed inclusive language efforts may actually stifle open communication. So it's something I think you need to be careful with. So how to avoid this outcome? First is you encourage people, don't mandate things, and lead by example. Call in, not out. What I mean by that, when someone called me in on the use of the brown bag, they just sent me an email just to me. It wasn't a reply all to everybody else and say, oh, by the way, did you know this? I appreciated that. So calling in, not out. Sometimes you appeal to a higher authority. You may have a code of conduct on your project. Your community in which you operate may have policies. And of course, Livermore Labs has inclusive policies. And you can always appeal to those higher authorities to motivate people to address what you think they might need to address. You can also make the business argument. Inclusion does impact productivity and a project's reach. Seek opportunities to raise awareness. For example, one of the tools I use in some contexts I operate is something called an inclusive moment. It's a small thing you can add to your existing team meetings to talk about inclusion issues, and maybe inclusive language would be one of those things. It is really, really important to strike the right balance of priorities. And in my opinion, it's really okay to err on the side of caution and to be slow and deliberate in your response to inclusive language issues. Let's see. I'll just end with this slide. So just because I think it's relevant to Livermore Labs, I don't know how many people may have seen. If you went to see Oppenheimer this summer, go ahead and type in the chat if you did. I did, week or so after it came out. And it got me interested. Yeah, I see a few people saying they saw it. It got me interested in some of the inclusive practices that were happening in the Manhattan Project at the time. And it just turns out there was a lot of inclusive stuff going on. I list several of them here. One of the things I found very interesting is between 42 and 45 in Los Alamos, over 300 babies were born. And they needed to do a lot. They needed to make daycare for that. Ultimately, they had a hospital for that. They created an elementary school for all the children that were there. There was actually a lot of effort in preparing food for the wide range of cultural dishes and people that were there. Women were employed in a lot of technical roles there. You're probably all familiar with that, whereas that was not the general case in the US workforce at the time. Quite a bit of religious diversity. So there was actually a lot of inclusive stuff going on in the Manhattan Project in the 1940s. And of course, you have to compare and contrast that with what else was going on in the country. Japanese internment camps. It turns out the Chinese Exclusion Act was still in effect in 1943. That's about a year into the Manhattan Project. There were massive displacements of populations in places like Los Alamos, White Sands, Nevada test site later on, the Marshall Islands, of course. If you not familiar with the case of the downwinders, there's actually multiple categories of downwinders depending on where they were downwind from. But the Trinity site, Hanford, Castle Bravo, if you're familiar with that, and Mississippi. If you were not aware of it, we detonated 2 nuclear devices in Mississippi, an salt dome underneath the ground in Mississippi. I was stunned to discover that. 1% to 2% of the worldwide background radiation is the result of U.S. nuclear testing. So inclusive practices really help a project, but we have to be also aware of cases where we haven't done the greatest job of that. So I think that's my last slide. Yeah, that's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions or maybe recycle through the chat. I'll stop sharing now. Okay. I'm looking in the chat. I don't know. Oh, I'm seeing captions. My apology. How do I get to chat? Okay, anybody feel free to come off mute and either ask questions or offer an additional remark you think might contribute to the discussion.
I'll just comment that I was, I'm very ignorant of all the different to those common phrases, those idiom, you know, and you just use, I just use them, right? And I
Right.
never even think about them because I've heard them before and I know what, you know, what the idiom means and stuff. And it's just, yeah, it's,
So what the experience you're describing, Eric, before I started to get sort of heavily interested in inclusive language, exactly the same way. I would rattle off, you know, phrase after phrase in email or talking. And now my experience is I'll get halfway through a sentence and I'm crafting an email and I'm like, why am I using that phrase? Do I really know what that
yeah.
means? Where does that come from? And often that will lead me to some investigation online. And then I'll say, well, if I'm not sure, you know, I think I'll make an adjustment in the language I'm using, or if I'm really sure, no, it's okay. You know, I'll move forward with it. But it has given me pause on a number of occasions.
Yeah, I've just gotten into that. Well, informal writing, they kind of say you shouldn't use idioms. So I think in written stuff, yeah, wouldn't tend to use it, but just talking in a group, I probably would. So
Yeah,
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 it's not considered a good practice, I think, in general.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's actually what the U.S. federal plain language they say avoid idioms at all costs. You know, yeah, people that aren't familiar with the culture are literally going to have no idea what you're
Yeah.
saying. You know? Let me cycle back through. So I want to see if there's people.
I had a question. I posted it in the chat.
Go ahead.
Regarding your closing thoughts about when to change for inclusive language stuff,
Uh-huh.
how do you reconcile like any implicit power dynamics between the people asking for a change, who might come from a marginalized community, and lead developers who might not? Do you have any advice for that?
Well, I guess I say partial advice. I do think it is important to listen to the voices of the impacted communities. And I think too often people will raise a concern about the use of language or other things, and they're quickly dismissed by the people in the dominant group because the dominant group doesn't necessarily have the same experience. And so I guess the only thing I'd say, it's really important to listen and to not just listen to those who may be saying it to you directly if they call you in, but also to go out and seek out sort of the thought leaders of the community on it as well. That's what I've done when I go online, is see, you know, who else has published on this, who else has spoken to this. And again, that's very difficult to do because the internet is really big and there's just a ton of noise out there. And on top of that, it's a lot of the sensationalistic stuff that gets a lot amplified, and the really hardcore sort of detailed and well-researched work often is kind of way over in a corner, and it takes a while to find it. So I hope that answers at least some of your question. Okay, see a thumbs up there. Boy, this is a shy group. No one else wants to ask questions here. I'm looking through.
Mark, I think this is a fantastic talk, and I really feel like, you know, we should have it in different venues, because this is a small group, you know, and I think your perspective is so well respected and you know, well thought through, that I hope that we can have this at maybe at the ASQ level and maybe in some larger forums.
Wow. Well, thanks for that, Stephanie. That's very kind of you. I appreciate that. Yeah, when I do think it's important, but at the same time, it's important to be able to sift through the noise to get to the really important stuff. And again, it's difficult to do that. And by noise, I don't mean to suggest there's anything disparaging in bringing up possible inclusive language issues. I do worry that a large segment of our community may have an interest in doing that only from the perspective of virtue signaling, as opposed to actually addressing real problems that people are experiencing and facing. And so that's what I mean as far as noise. It's getting through to really making sure that we take our steps deliberately and in response to real things that people are experiencing.
Well, and I think that we can, we were recording this, correct? And
That's correct.
post that and kind of share that broadly. Just for reference. But I really appreciate the comments also, and hopefully some of those can be addressed. But personally, I didn't know brown bag had roots that they have, and so this is really informative. And I know that the more I learn, the I certainly don't want to be using terms that might be derogatory in any way, shape, or form. So if I don't know it, I would use it, and so knowing it is helpful. So
Sure, sure. And again, in that case, at least I believe there are believed to be multiple origins for that. It's not clear that the use that Elisa Kerr had discovered was being used. Actually, it turns out in a lot of sororities and fraternities across the South. Uh, um, it's not clear that there's any relationship to its use there, which is definitely perpetuation of racism, to its use in the context of people bringing their own lunch to work, for example, which that's the typical image you might have is construction workers coming to work and they all come in with a brown bag. They may be related, but they may not be. I'm inclined to believe they're not related, but that's just me.
yes, I know every time I used the term, it was bring your lunch, we're doing this at lunch.
Mhm.
But yeah, again, if we don't know that something is a heated term, heated maybe is a wrong term in and of itself, but thank you. I mean, it just is really helpful, and we can be more thoughtful at work. We have a variety of people here that, we just really don't want to be offending people inadvertently. So thank you.
And yeah, and that, to be honest, that's another thing that you mentioned there, Stephanie. So taking, for example, brown bag, I mean, if I realized, for me, how hard is it for me as an individual to change it's not. If somebody says, I'd really like you to not use that phrase, and by the way, it's an idiom, I'm pretty much on board with adjusting my own language personally. I do think that there is a distinction between what the choices individuals make in a lot of this space and what may be proposed as policy for an organization overall. Once you get into policy and sort of trying to suggest that a large and as that policy grows from maybe a particular code group to all of computing at Livermore Labs, to all of Livermore Labs, to all of DOE. As that scope grows, I think much greater care needs to be taken in terms of deciding, do we really need to address this term? Is this term causing harm, and can the work we're doing to change it address some of that harm? In other words, there's a difference between individual choices and sort of mandates from organizations. Thanks for the thumbs up. I see Dale gave me a thumbs up there.
Yeah, let me just follow that thread a little bit, and I'm going to ask you for something based on your personal experiences dealing with this. I would expect, based on what's happened with comments in various articles in Newsline and things over the last few years, that there will be people that, when things are proposed, potentially at a project level, but certainly at a policy level, like you said, that are going to push back very strongly against that. So for the various projects and groups that you've worked with, have you run into that, and how do you alleviate, maybe not get them to totally buy in, but at least get them to understand that it's not an issue against them personally for using these kind of terms?
So yeah, it turns out, Dale, I don't have a lot of experience trying to establish a policy for groups larger than a code team.
Okay.
And so code teams and the code teams in which I've worked with so far have been relatively receptive to various suggestions. I've not seen any resistance to, for example, replacing master slave, though I know that the AL3D team and the Sierra team did experience a significant social engineering effort to market that among all of their stakeholders, including their user base, because a lot of that terminology actually came out into the user interfaces, for example, the input decks for the code and so forth. And so but I also think that that was somewhat unique in that what was going on in the country at the time in 2020, that's the summer that George Floyd was murdered. There was just a very heightened awareness about a lot of this, and there were, I think, a lot of people clamoring for ways that they felt they could push the needle. And so as a result, a lot of people were interested in supporting that effort. I think I saw someone come off mute and then maybe go back on mute. I hope I didn't talk too long and discourage you from talking. Okay, I don't know if that answered your question, Dale.
It did. It was more just curiosity if you had run into that. You know, because things
Yeah.
got very heated on lab comment pages for quite a while because, you know, people felt that other people's feelings were given a higher priority than their feelings, kind of thing. So I would expect that, you know, you alluded to that directly in policies that you know, I would expect that to happen again.
Yeah. Go. Did I hear someone else's
Yeah,
voice?
yeah, I'll just speak up. So I haven't talked to a bunch of people, but I have had some people at the lab like pull me aside and say, "Hey, why do I need to change my language in this way or that way? Like, can you like this just seems like silly to me, or like this seems like it's too much." And like I have talked them into changing their language. And like the way to do it, at least in one-on-one conversations, is just through empathy and just say, hey, like, imagine that you're in this position and you have to like hear stuff like this every day. It gets really, really grating. And take it from that rather than using like the terminology of microaggressions and stuff like that. But that's been the successful approach for me.
Oh, great point, Robert. Thanks for sharing that experience.
Yeah, in general, like approaching it from a point of view of empathy, seems to be the most successful, I've found. Like I had to go through a whole bunch of stuff. Like we had 3 kids diagnosed with autism, and the amount of like ableism that my kids have had to face like really kind of changed my point of view on a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, that experience, that's like me and the experience when my wife was wheelchair bound for a while. I had a much greater appreciation for disability issues after I'd experienced it myself. Um, and I think that's true of all of us. And unfortunately, it's a bias we all have, and especially people who are in sort of dominant dominant culture, or whatever, really have it is that they may not have the experiences of many other people, and getting them to somehow understand what it's like to walk in their shoes is yeah, part of the whole discussion.
And
So
and
thanks
like
for
a
sharing
part of
that.
this, like I mean, when you're going over things like, like you hear a lot of talks about privilege and stuff like that, and that's a term that makes people like very kind of get emotional. But when you take people down one-on-one, you say, hey, like, you don't have to worry about this stuff. And that is something that you don't have to do that other people do have to worry about. And like that is the definition of privilege. And so like you putting a little more thought into how you're doing stuff, it just by you putting just like a tiny fraction of more thought, it makes everyone's life so much easier.
Yep. Yep. Thank you for that, Robert. I want to circle back to a couple of comments in the chat. Let's see, from Alan Chen. What's your recommendation if we see terms, for example, computer code, used by others that are not inclusive? Go ahead to update their code? No, I wouldn't necessarily recommend just putting a PR in and say, by the way, I'm giving you this PR because I think you need to make your code more inclusive. I think, depending on the context, you want to have a conversation with the team and work through that. Even if it's master slave, which is, you've saw those instances on that, I think you want to have a conversation with the team. And by the way, that master slave issue is definitely a lot bigger issue in code development going on in the United States than it is in certain parts of Europe. And there's a link in the slides. I'll get the slides there, Eric, but there's a great dialogue about this in the Redis software, and how to replace it there, and what reasons some of the gatekeepers had in that for not replacing it. So anyhow, very nuanced topic for sure. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to to attend and listen in and contribute. And yeah, thanks so much. And I don't know where the recording will go, Eric, but
It'll go on the Swing website has a
Swing website.
The
Okay.
Swing well, I can give it to you too, I guess.
Okay.
The Swing website has list of all our, our presentations for the monthly meeting. So there'll be the slides posted there as well as the recording.
Okay. All right. Okay, well, I see we're up on the hour, and great. I enjoyed the dialogue. And again, thanks everyone for coming, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Mark. Great
Right.
talk.
Thank you, Mark.